Professor Angus Dalgleish, thank you very much indeed for joining the Truth Contract.
I'm delighted to. Thank you.
Before we jump in, would you please give our viewers and listeners a 1-2 minute bio on you?
Okay, I'm now emeritus professor at the University of London, having been the foundation professor of oncology at St George's since 1992. And I'm a consultant medical oncologist as a clinician, but I have been told I'm unique, that I've also had the unique opportunity to be a consultant virologist, consultant immunologist, and a consultant general physician, which is no longer possible these days. And with regards to my research, it really is what launched me into research was working with Robin Weiss at the Institute of Cancer Research on viruses that cause cancer, and particularly retroviruses. And that's when HIV came along. And I discovered the receptor and how the virus causes the disease, etc., and why the vaccine approach that Fauci et al. Pushed forward and have kept pushing forward for 40 years would never ever work. This insight gave me the ability to manipulate this, the immune response against HIV, as inducing an immune response against cancer. It's a complex area, but we were one of the first to do cancer immunotherapy in the UK. I was the first to use high-dose interleukin-2 and then vaccines of various descriptions and the immunotherapy. And this has been side by side by producing good vaccine candidates for HIV, unlike Fauci's. Ours actually works with Berger Sorensen in Norway. Several in cancer, of which we've focused that the simplest and most non-specific of all the vaccines is the most effective. And then more recently, I've taken all this experience into COVID and why a vaccine for COVID was basically never necessary, and the one that they went forward with had guaranteed toxicity. And in spite of alerting everybody to this, even with the services of Richard Dearlove, that although the many people listened, Valence brushed it aside, as did Whitty.
Okay, well, I think that's a great summary. Thank you. Today we're going to talk all about COVID and in particular mRNA.
Mm-hmm.
And by way of background, over 5 years ago, when COVID came out, I listened to what the government and the media were telling us, but I also started listening to programs like The High Wire and to guest appearances by scientists and epidemiologists and virologists, including yourself. So I probably watched at least half of the hundreds of interviews you've given over the last 5 years. So it's a real privilege for you to be with us today. What I'd like to do today is record a conversation which is aimed at the general public. And I've created a whole series of questions. And if you're okay with it, I'd like you to answer the questions as best you can with yes or no, fact or fiction, true or false. And if it does require a little bit more explanation, please bear in mind that our audience are not epidemiologists and virologists, and try and keep the answer as if I was a patient rather than another medical expert. Is that okay with you?
That's fine.
And what I would like to do, I want to approach this from the point of view, I've studied this for 5 years. I'm not a doctor. And I keep coming up with, well, how can that be true if that's true? And if we've been told this, but someone else is telling me that, which of the two is true? And that's how I've come to this. So if you're okay with that process, I want to start off with some basic virology and a bit about basic pandemics, if you like. So C19 was labelled as a naturally occurring virus. Was it naturally occurring?
No.
Was it man-made?
Yes.
Has the C19 virus ever been isolated?
Yes.
Where can anyone find the COVID-19 isolation peer-reviewed evidence?
In the published sequence, which makes a lot of sense to the viruses that we know were in the Wuhan laboratory at the time, and the fact that the sequence shows inserts that were put in by the laboratory, which when it escaped, which is what I'll be kind enough to say, when it escaped, it had 6 inserts of the in the receptor binding complex of a ordinary bat coronavirus backbone, and this gave it the ability to bind to the ACE2 receptor, which is the known receptor for this, with extraordinary avidity and affinity, and that 2 of these inserts had previously been published with the conclusion they made the bat viruses more likely to infect human cells, and this was shown. Now, in order to get these viruses to be able to infect cells, they have to passage them in cells. And we know they did this. This is all described. They would put the ACE receptor into various cells to enhance the ability of these viruses to bind to it. It is this putting of this receptor in that they used a HIV vector to express this receptor, which is where the HIV sequences come from that many people have noted. So yes, the virus is isolatable, and I'm very aware that people say it's not been isolated, but I've spoken to many people who have isolated it, and especially I was in South Africa last year, and the year before last, and was in the laboratory where they isolated and sequenced the Omicron variant, which I regard as one of the most important players in the whole COVID outbreak, on the grounds that it had evolved so far away from the original that it was very infectious and very non-pathogenic. It hardly caused any disease at all.
Okay, sorry, just to pause a second. So there are naturally occurring viruses, but the COVID-19 took a naturally occurring bat virus and it was manipulated using gain of function technology to make it more virulent and more dangerous. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's exactly what they were doing. They were trying to get it to be super trained to infect humans. Why you would want to do that, I have no idea.
Well, maybe we'll come on to that. So what were the UK authorities' stated benefits of vaccine-induced immunity versus natural immunity with the COVID-19 virus?
Well, it is interesting that the various people in charge of who made pronouncements, such as the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer, Whitty and Valence, basically made some sensible observations right at the very beginning on the grounds, and I quote, that this is the sort of virus that only natural immunity can really deal with, and therefore it's a herd immunity and it should be allowed to just run its course. These were remarkably sane observations, and I totally agreed with them. The other observation which was made, and I think it's very important, this one was made by witty, I understand, was that you cannot possibly justify a vaccine for a virus unless it kills about 30% of the people it infects. I think those are very, very important considering what happened. Something happened. They went from this fairly logical stance to what I regard as an insane stance of the way we managed the COVID so-called pandemic. And I believe it wasn't a pandemic by the definitions of global pandemics.
Okay, so there is evidence that it was made by humans in a lab.
I believe it's overwhelming. I've had discussed this with many people. I think Matt Ridley is very interesting because he wrote a book called Viral with Elisa Chan. And they started off to find the origins, thinking it probably came from a cave in a part of China 1,000 miles away from Wuhan, and that it was a natural jump by bringing the virus from the cave to the laboratory. However, he moved, like many other people did, and my very good colleague Stephen Key did. He did it by Bayesian analysis of all the information available, and he moved from 99% chance that it came from a bat and jumped into a human to 99% chance that it was made in the lab and escaped and infected humans. So that was very interesting. However, Matt Ridley says we will never know. Well, I disagree. We do know. And we know from the sequence, because the sequences have inserts in them which could never, ever occur naturally. If they were to occur, there would be one of them and they'd probably be edited out. The reason I'm converted to this conclusion is very simple. My learned molecular biology, virology, immunologist people all tell me it could all be random. They are clearly not, do not embrace the next stage beyond sequences. Sequences are only useful when they program amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. Now, those runs of amino acids and the inserts are all highly positively charged. Natural inserts would be neutral. At the most, in these runs of 4, which they have inserted, they're all positively charged. If that happened naturally, it would be edited out. So to me, to put it in a single sentence, this SARS-2 virus that escaped from the lab has a charge of 8. No normal coronavirus has a charge more than 6. And as I said, if it were to have such an insert by natural mutation, it would be edited out because nature has rules, and especially biochemical and biophysical rules. And I believe the people who say that the evidence doesn't stand up don't understand those rules. In fact, the paper that the journal that finally took our heavily edited version of all this evidence, but it was all there in plain sight, was the only editor of the journal who was actually a biochemist who immediately understood the argument and agreed to publish it, even though it was clear everybody was under a lot of pressure not to publish it. We had 5 journals, all of whom rejected our paper when we submitted this, showing that it clearly came from the lab. All of them said, we don't argue with the science, but this is not in the public interest. Can you believe that? And some of them came back within 5 hours. So this was programmed. They were programmed by a big top-down authority. Do not publish anything telling the truth, is how I would translate it very simply.
In the last week, Jeffrey Sachs and Dr. David E. Martin have both recorded videos on X claiming that it was actually manufactured in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and involved funding from DARPA. Do you believe there's any truth to those claims?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. Now, the reason we came to that conclusion was when they started doing these inserts, there wasn't a single paper that did not have the name Ralph Baric on it. Ralph Baric is a very, very eminent molecular biologist whose big star was he was the first to be able to link RNA together in such a way you couldn't see the stitching. I remember talking to senior people who basically talked down to me and said, if there had been any engineering, they would have left a mark. You always do. And I had to point out to them that Ralph Baric achieved all his accolades because he was the first to be able to do this. And he was on all the papers. So the actual stitching up, as it were, was probably all done in Chapel Hill. In those papers where his name appears, that when it comes to acknowledgements, the acknowledgements acknowledge the Eco Health Alliance and that the funding comes from a special grant from the NIAID head, Tony Fauci. I mean, it's there in plain sight. I did not have to do much research to know what was going on. And what I find incredible is that my scientific peers and colleagues seem to be so lazy when it comes to this. I mentioned Matt Ridley. He went to the Royal Society to discuss the evidence, the scientific evidence. And he told me that he spoke to 3 people who were put together to discuss this, all of whom said they hadn't bothered to look at the sequences in detail because it was obvious it came from a bat. That's meant to be the bastion of science, can't be bothered to look at the evidence. It's a disgrace.
Angus, doesn't this meet the definition of a bioweapon?
Yes, it does.
Isn't that illegal?
Yes, it is.
So an illegal bioweapon was made in a lab, initially in America, that was then played with further in China. Is that correct?
Yes.
So was it an accidental leak, or do you think it was released on purpose?
I think it was an accidental leak. I believe that at the time because of the panic that ensued when it leaked in the reports, etc., and the fact that the human incompetence is far more common than sort of malign design. And there's very good evidence for this. Prior to the SARS-2 leak, there were 6 reports of serious SARS-1 leaks from top laboratories around the world, highlighting the potential danger of doing this work, however high the restrictions were. And there was also a safety assessment of the Wuhan lab, who actually said that the safety conditions and the security was woeful a year before all this happened. So I think it fits some piece of incompetence. However, had that not happened, why were you doing this? You were clearly working up to make a very efficient bioweapon. And when the leak occurred and the pandemonium ensued and it's the chaos, everything, clearly this was not done deliberately because of the way China reacted and their panic measures that they did, etc. I mean, when this was done, the head of the Wuhan lab was fired and he was replaced by somebody who previously had the title of head of the bioweapons program for the People's Republic of China. Now, you don't have to be a great detective to work out what's going on when you put those simple facts together.
We'll come on to achieve what a little bit later. So can a man-made virus mutate, or do variants also need to be created manually?
Yes, it can mutate. And of course, if you put a very highly abnormal charge in it, it's going to mutate, I would say, downwards, which is really what happened, i.e. it attenuates. It is interesting that
What does attenuate mean?
It means it becomes less infectious, less dangerous.
gets weaker.
Gets weaker. And that happens with all virus waves, by the way. But if you make it super infectious, it's going to attenuate, get less of a problem much quicker, which is actually what we saw.
Is herd immunity possible if a virus is man-made?
Oh, yes. It doesn't matter really whether it's man-made or natural. You will get the herd immunity because, and the important thing here was this was an air-to-air aerosol transmission virus. It wasn't a touch type virus, which Ebola was. You could only get it from touching. This was air-to-air transmission, ideal for herd immunity. Does it exist? Yes, of course it exists. I'm a living example that it exists. I have a very high T-cell response against the SARS virus. I refuse to have the vaccines. And I was never ever ill when all my friends were collapsing with shortness of breath and all the usual things. I never ever had it. But I was able then to get my T-cell response tested and compared on a vaccine study. And I had the highest T-cell response against the virus of anybody they tested. And I was over 70. The average age of people they tested was about 30, and they'd all had 2 vaccines. So that told me immediately I was a herd immunity. And then I found papers showing that herd immunity gives you much stronger T-cell responses than the vaccines do. Well, I told them all right that from the beginning, that would be the case. So instead of having these highly dangerous vaccines, they should have used ones that boost innate immunity. And I was working on one as part of a cancer trial. And this again convinced me that something very sinister was going on, because we had hundreds of patients who'd benefited, and anecdotally, none of these patients had got flu in a bad flu year, let alone COVID. Chris Whitty basically turned this offer down, saying it clearly needed more testing in animals. This was a vaccine that had been nearly a decade in hundreds of patients and not a single negative trial and not a single adverse event, serious adverse event. Not even grade 3 or 4. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Were there warnings or whistleblowers about a potential pandemic before COVID-19 erupted?
Well, I think there always were, and that's one of the reasons that they had these exercises in how to deal with them. And one of the things that I remember, this was when Sally Davis was Chief Medical Officer, and they had exercise, how would we deal with it, cope when one of these pandemics comes out. So they had a bit of a plan. It was called Signet, I think this was the name they gave to it, Baby Swan. And they came to the conclusion that they could deal with it, etc. But they were never prepared for it properly. They just thought they could. I do remember Sally Davis saying that the WHO felt that things were in place that should there ever be an outbreak in China or Asia, it would never reach Europe. So no need to worry.
There are, of course, many conspiracy theorists who say that it was all planned and was a plandemic.
I'm finding it increasingly hard to argue with them. And the evidence that everybody suddenly changed their minds and reacted like they'd been infected with a brain virus under total control from someone really high above, the UN, WHO, DAPRA, American Defense Department, etc., is entirely fitting with this. I mean, it's just beyond belief. I never thought I'd live to see it.
So was the C19 jab invented and patented before the outbreak of COVID?
Well, you know as well as I do, I hope, that Moderna patented the sequence in February 2019. And the going back, I mean, there's just tons on this. And you mentioned David Martin; he can tell you see everything. But going back, it looks like this was all part of a project where the big pharma would only do these vaccines as if there was something to fight. So it was all part of a plan on the grounds there's no point researching and doing vaccines unless you're going to give us an opportunity to sell them. I mean, this is all beginning to unravel.
So there is emerging evidence that it was a pandemic created in order to get people vaccinated.
Yes.
So how do vaccines typically work, and how was the COVID-19 mRNA jab different?
Well, vaccines are normally, the way they're perceived is that they induce antibody responses to a specific registration plate, as it were, on the virus. And that's how vaccines normally work. The problem comes is if you have...
To put that very simply, you take a tiny, tiny little bit of leptospirosis or parvovirus and you inject it in your puppy, which means that they have immunity then from those canine diseases because they've had a tiny little bit of it injected into them, and their natural immunity then fights it off and deals with it. Is that correct?
Yes, it's not. It's yeah, but the vaccine people depend very much on antibodies being raised, and herein lies actually a piece of total sophistry that they use to push the vaccines and especially the boosters. On the grounds you can measure the antibody response, but it wanes quite quickly, which is why they said, well, you must have another one, and it wanes quite quickly. And then you must have another one. Well, I mean, from my experience of vaccines, if a vaccine needs a booster, it doesn't work. And I think COVID has proven that exceptionally well.
Was COVID-19 the first time that mRNA had been used on such a large scale?
Yes. Now, messenger RNA is not new. I've been on the scientific board was on the board of CureVac, which calls itself the messenger RNA company. And that was I was on it for 5 years, left over 8 years ago. And we were using messenger RNA for all sorts of cancer vaccines and other bad vaccines. And yet, all those years later, it never got past the safety test to use on vaccines. So they use this pandemic as an excuse to get emergency approval for a vaccine platform, which is not a vaccine, but a gene therapy. And they completely lied to everybody about this. This is a highly dangerous, uncontrollable form of technology to use as a vaccine. And as you know, I've been part of a worldwide fight to have these banned immediately. If you want to use messenger RNA, you call it gene therapy and you use it for serious terminal diseases like cancer and other genetic problems. You do not use it so you get multiple assaults on children, 5-year-olds, etc. When we have 10 major reasons, and actually it's counting. I think last time I looked, there were 13 ways in which messenger RNA vaccines could induce or drive cancer. I mean, if you only had one of those, you wouldn't want it near your 5-year-old to immunize them against a disease which they had no chance of dying from unless they caught leukemia. I mean, or developed leukemia. I mean, it's absolute madness.
What does emergency use authorization mean, and how does that differ from a standard approval?
Well, it means they can throw the rule book out the window. The rule book that they use for small biotechs or academics like me who develop something, and they throw all these regulatory hurdles up. Well, we have to make sure it's completely safe, and you show it's safe. Oh, but there may be long-term side effects we don't know about. We must do the trials to look for these, and we must be sure that it works. They didn't do any of that. They completely threw the rule book out. They never did any genotoxicity. They never did any carcinogenicity. That was emergency regulation. They used the regulation as if they were at war, that this was a war. Everything's off the table. We use whatever missiles we have to hurl at the enemy. This is what they use. And this is for a disease which, when the vaccines came out, we knew it only killed 0.085% of people that were infected with it with an average age of 82. It was totally unjustifiable. And yet the chief medical officer approved all this, not only for old adults initially, but overrode the JCVI to give it to children for an infection that never killed a child. I mean, it is beyond belief, the stupidity of the decisions that were made. And they're not just stupid, they're criminally stupid in my book.
Is it true that in a standard vaccination approval process, you'd have to have a long-term safety test where it's measured against I think it's called a double-blind placebo control group?
Yes.
Was that done with the COVID-19 jabs?
No. There was the early trial. It was randomized. Now, if you read the people who've looked at these trials very carefully, they tried to cover all this up. They went to extreme lengths to cover it up. It's been remarkably well researched by Robert J. Kennedy in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and also in Fauci's First Fraud, where basically, with Fauci's First Fraud, that book showed that Fauci had been using these techniques in the HIV era, something I lived through and hadn't cottoned on to till a long, long time after. And what they did, they randomized the study, and when they found out there were very bad side effects on it, they argued that it was not morally correct to deprive the poor people on the placebo of the vaccine, so everybody got it. And that way, the side effects didn't become clear in the vaccine arm because it was drowned out by all the people in the placebo receiving the vaccine who had it. There were unbelievable number of side effects, but they were all ignored. In fact, in that VAERS data from Pfizer, that if you had a serious adverse event from the vaccine, you had a 3% chance of dying. And this is a vaccine against a virus that gave you an 0.085% chance of dying. I mean, what were they thinking of? They should have banned that. The FDA, totally culpable. CDC, totally culpable. What were they thinking of? I mean, what kind of virus had infected them? This is a mass psyop. They ignored all the evidence. And as you know, in trying to put all this together, I ended up co-editing a book, which we had no other option but to call it The Death of Science, because that's what it was.
In excluding COVID-19 in a sort of standard new vaccine, how is safe and effective actually measured?
It wasn't. It was basically straight out of Orwell's Ministry of Truth. It is, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes a fact. And if you challenge it, then you're a non-person or you're an anti-vaxxer. They use terms so as you don't engage in debate or scientific conversation. I mean, we know socially they use racist to damp everything down. Well, in science, they use anti-vaxxer to damp everything down. There was no evidence they were safe. Right from the beginning, anybody who was observing them, and certainly in America, you had Peter McCullough, who was, I mean, he basically said he went from seeing 2 myocarditis cases in his career to hundreds and then thousands. Here in the UK, we had Asim Mahudra came to exactly the same conclusion. Now, these are senior doctors. What happens? They get ostracized. They get reported as incompetent and not able to be proper doctors for not obeying basically dystopian fascist orders. I mean, that's really what was going on. No debate was allowed here, which is what I find absolutely terrifying, is that we've lost the freedom of speech, we've lost the freedom to debate.
What was the stated intended benefit from using mRNA?
The state of intended benefit was they basically wanted to have a platform that they could use and manufacture new viruses, vaccines for new viruses very quickly in the say 6 or 7 months. And they've pushed everybody, including the UK and Australia, into us giving them money to have factories to do this for future oncoming viruses. It is an absolute disaster. You would never use messenger RNA on your children if you knew even a fraction of the real facts. I mean, I just cannot believe that's what they wanted to do. But they found out it was going to be highly profitable. And I'm afraid it is that simple. It is the only goal. It is a way of making vast profits very, very quickly. Bill Gates, who I thought masqueraded as a philanthropist and a charity, boasted to his business friends that he's never made so much money so quickly and through the messenger RNA vaccines and his investments in Moderna, etc. I mean, that kind of sums it up. But the problem is with messenger RNA is it's highly dangerous, it's uncontrollable. If I could just tell you something that I know that your viewers, to make it very, very simple, the degree of specious argument and sophistry that people go to. I finally was given a platform in the Mail on Sunday to say that I believe that these vaccines are kicking cancers into touch, interfering with the ability to control them. And I'm seeing an increase in cancer in patients who've had these messenger RNA vaccines. And I had others, James Royal, who's a colorectal surgeon, he's in complete agreement, these are completely different cancers, etc. So they have to balance it on the other side. So on the other side are a couple of eminent scientists, experts. They weren't clinicians, they're eminent scientific experts, who roll out the specious fact. That means what they said was correct. They said, well, messenger RNA, we all know messenger RNA, we get foreign messenger RNA every day in our bodies from all over the place, from food, the air, and the body is very good at immediately getting rid of it, and there's no risk whatsoever. These people are just scaremongering. So what they said was actually true. What they didn't say was that because it's so easy to destroy the messenger RNA, in order to use it as a vaccine, you have to stabilize it so it escapes this automatic destruction. Therein lies the problem. They haven't been able to stabilize it to the point where it's safe. I mean, if you could put something into it that, say, a gene like they use, say, a herpes virus gene, and they do this in gene therapy, and if it starts to get out of control, you use the antiviral drug aimed at the gene therapy and it collapses. Now, they hadn't even thought to do that for the messenger RNA, which is I regard as extreme carelessness. And if they are going to pursue with it, that's the sort of way they're going to do it. But that would make it too complicated for vaccine use. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to say that they say, well, there's nothing else apart from messenger RNA. They tried DNA, it didn't work. It's very interesting that DNA vaccines do make a lot of sense. But once the animal's bigger than a dog, it doesn't work. So when you get to primates and humans, it just doesn't work. So that's why they went back to messenger RNA. Now, I think if they were proper virologists and proper immunologists, they would realize is that all these viruses that we are at risk of, flu, COVID, RSV, they're all airborne respiratory viruses, etc. And they do not depend on antibody as their main control. They depend on your innate immunity, your primitive T cells. Now, what happens when you come to about 55? Your innate immunity and your primitive front guard T cells fall off a cliff to the point when you're over 70, they're hardly there. Now, it's interesting if you can bear that image in your mind, the immune system falling down like a ski slope, and overlay it with the cancer incidence, which starts rising significantly at 55 and peaks about 75. Now, this wonderful correlation does not necessarily mean causation, but I've spent my lifetime basically looking at, can you boost this collapse of the innate immune system and improve your control of cancer? The answer is yes. And by doing that, my cancer patients have reported to me, it's incredible. Since receiving this treatment, I never get cold or flu. And the same patients, not one of them got COVID in our first wave through the hospital, where everybody else was going off sick for days and suffering all sorts of symptoms. And, this is what, again, when I pointed to Whitty, this is the answer. Give this to all the people on the front line and the people at risk. Oh, no, it needs more animal testing. How brainless is that?
So does mRNA alone or in combination with other ingredients in the jabs, excuse me, reduce the quality of the immune system, short, medium, or long term?
Yes. And you're also dealing with the other constituents, these lipid nanoparticles, which is another big component of it, which you do not want because that helps the RNA integrate. And once it integrates into your genome, it's basically, letting a child loose in a park, or so you don't know what they're going to do next, where they're going to go, what chaos is going to ensue. And that's exactly what happens. It can integrate. That might be quite safe, but if it integrates, it causes frame shifting, and this can lead to the various bits of it that promote being next to a dormant cancer gene. And then we know many other ways it can go. It can bind to the very genes that control cancer and prevent them doing it. It's just a nightmare once you look at what can do.
Okay, so sorry to in a short sentence, what is DNA?
Well, DNA is basically your code. It's your sort of 4 amino acid code, which is all your genes, and it puts them all in your chromosomes. So it's like a big library, so you can go and access things at the right time.
And so does mRNA alter the DNA?
Well, it can do the other way. I'm just going to say the classic thing is DNA, which makes RNA, which makes protein, which, if you're in the biotech industry, makes money. But yes, RNA can affect DNA, and that is how retroviruses work, RNA retroviruses. Famous example of that is HIV, except it didn't cause a cancer directly. Its association with cancer was purely by destroying the immune system, controlling cancer.
Are there tests that can check for changes in the immune system function after vaccination?
Yes. And they have the industry have focused totally on antibodies and saying, the antibody response is falling, we must do a booster. Now, my whole point of this, I said about the innate immune system, it's T cell. And I said right from the beginning, you want T cell responses, not antibodies. T cell are the controllers. If an antibody is necessary, they send out messages to B cells who make out the antibodies. You don't need to do that artificially. And that's some would say it's a fairly unique view, but I would say it's the right view, having been at the coalface for so many years. This is the T cell response that's far more important than the B cell response. And what the messenger RNA vaccines do, wait for it, after they third vaccine, i.e. the first booster, they switched the T-cell response off. I mean, you couldn't have a worse outcome, which is why we see the cancers suddenly take off after the boosters. And it's worse than that. Not only do they switch the T-cell response off, but having flogged the antibody response to death, the antibody response is exhausted and switches to a tolerizing antibody called IgG4. So you actually have the perfect storm. By boosting the immune response, you actually switch the whole immune system off, which is why every study's looked shown that the more boosters they have, the more likely you are to get COVID, flu, and any other infection going, and you're more likely you are to get cancer. Initially, I thought it was the immune cancers like melanoma, lymphoma, but it now looks like it's across the board. All the big data from Japan, Italy, Czechoslovakia, everywhere that's looked, it looks like it's across the board.
So, if I've understood you correctly, what I'm hearing is that this means that anyone who's been jabbed is a GMO, a genetically modified organism.
Potentially is the word. We know that these vaccines can be cleared, which is the good news.
So it is reversible.
It is reversible, but there are a lot of people out there. It's not going to happen naturally, and they need to have a detox program to get rid of that spike protein that's being produced by your own cells now. It's been programmed to produce the spike protein. And
so what can people do to detox or heal themselves?
Now, people have many different ideas on this, but there's some which really come through very high. First of all is vitamin D. The ubiquitous vitamin D is very good for restoring flagging immune responses. I would say that's number one. Then Peter McCullough and lots of people throughout the people who've been the first to realise this was massive toxicity have been advocating a number of natural products such as nattokinase, especially for myocarditis, N-acetylcysteine, and some special versions of it have been very high up the list. And I was surprised to see on the list bromelain, very high up the list. This is another drug I've researched as an anti-cancer drug. It's pineapple core extract. And why I believe it is so good is that a very high percentage of bromelain is enzymes. It's not the eating pineapple, it is only in the core. And I believe that the data I've seen suggests that the enzymes in bromelain are very good at dissolving the residual spike protein. We haven't got the full data on that, but people are working on it. And then the other one, I've had a lot of people with very serious long COVID issues. And it's people go on about long COVID, about the virus and all this, that, and the. Now, all the ones I have seen since the vaccine came out, people have got long COVID after vaccination. And most clinicians who've involved this would completely accept that. The industry tried to counter this with a high-profile anecdotal reports of people who had long COVID cured with vaccine. They seem to be like literally anecdotal. The vast majority of people I've seen have had long COVID from the vaccine. And because of the science we did, we showed that there was remarkable similarity between the inflammation of cancer and the inflammation of COVID. Both these agents, both these conditions produce high levels of a growth factor called interleukin-6. And my group in the lab had shown that low-dose naltrexone is very good for turning off interleukin-6. And I've been using it in the cancer patients for years. And then I got asked, can you treat me? I've got long COVID. And I'll say, yes, that's fine, because you have high IL-6, and we know this reduces IL-6. Well, I was amazed at the number of people who had really quite marked improvement and then complete improvement just using low-dose naltrexone. They obviously had a load of other vitamin D and all that sort of thing. And so I was suggesting for anti-toxicity, some low-dose naltrexone would be very useful as well. And I was delighted to see that others have come to the same conclusion. A group in Australia, and Ryan Cole in the States, he came up to me at a meeting. He said, "I'm really excited about the potential of dealing with this post-vaccine work. Have you heard of low-dose naltrexone?" Well, I've been working on it for over 20 years and as an anti-cancer agent, so I was fully aware. So yes, the answer is there's reasons to be very optimistic that we can reverse a lot of this damage. But what is really unbelievable...
Sorry, I just press pause before I forget. If after we've finished this recording, you've got any links or papers that you could email me, I will make sure that they go in, the links and the papers go into the show notes, because I know lots of people are very keen to find out, is this reversible? What should I do? So any help that you could give our audience would be fantastic. I want to zoom through the next couple of sections back to our yes, no, fact, fiction, if that's all right. So did the jabs include mercury and aluminium?
I don't know, but the vast majority of vaccines previously did.
Aren't mercury and aluminium toxic?
Yes.
What is graphene oxide?
Well, graphene oxide is a component which is in these vaccines that people have.
Why was that included?
Do you know? I don't know.
Isn't graphene oxide a self-assembling nanobot?
Well, that's what it's claimed to be, and it's it's had a lot of spotlight on it as being the discovery and substance of the future. I think Nobel Prizes and things like that for it.
There are many posts online showing big white blood clots that have appeared in corpses, in undertakers and funeral directors since the jab rollout. Are these due to the jabs?
Yes, without a doubt. Why do I say that? Because they were never reported before the jabs came along, except that the very odd anecdote, you'd write it up and that would be it. Very, very rare. They became exceptionally common after the jabs rolled out, and it was the undertakers who were the first. It was
yes, I followed John O'Looney on X.
John, yes, exactly. He made, and why is this? Well, there are many possible explanations for it. One that I've discussed, because I'm somebody I always want to know why and how. I mean, that's just what drives me in everything. I just don't take anything at face example. And one hematologist who understands immunology felt that it was induction of an auto antibody, which that would make sense because most of the side effects of the vaccine are actually autoimmunity of one form or another. And we predicted that when we alerted everybody when the sequence came out on the spike protein that 80% of it had similarities with human epitopes. Therefore, autoimmunity would be guaranteed. And we highlighted platelet factor 4 and myelin, and both of which are up there as inducing severe autoimmunity, even on the MHRA website. So there's Paul Baric has catalogued that there's 131 autoimmune diseases being associated with the vaccines. So you can see it's a wide diaspora, which is why they've been able to push it down as not important, very rare. But if you add them all together, it's just unbelievable. So it's the fact they're all different.
So each of 130 isn't a big number, but you add up the 130 together, it's a gigantic number.
Exactly. So my hematologist colleague said, what I suspect, he said, in the clotting pathway, there is a very important part in it. That if you had an antibody to it, you wouldn't break down and you'd end up accumulating fibrin and amyloid. Now, he said, I think that might be the most likely explanation. It's not my idea, but it fits with my understanding. So it's definitely induced by the antibody. They didn't see it at the height of the COVID deaths. Didn't see it at all. It was all more microclotting and inflammation. It wasn't thrombus clotting that they saw.
Last question on ingredients. Did the C19 jabs contain a monkey virus called SV40?
Well, that sequence is certainly in the Pfizer vaccine.
Doesn't that cause cancer?
It is used to induce cancer. Its first association was with polio vaccine, wasn't it? But I mean, SV40 was used to induce cancers in mice, so you could test your anti-cancer activity against it. So it should not have been in it. And I have seen the defense molecular biologists say it's not the whole sequence, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't. I mean, the whole sequence, it only needs a bit to promote, and it's dangerous. It should never be there.
Okay, let's move on to, I want to try and pull all this together. So since in the last 5 years, since COVID started, and I guess the jabs came out 4 years ago, have we seen excess deaths from the C19 jab?
Of course we have. They are horrendous. And the first person to pick it up was the insurance companies, Edward Dowd, who noted an incredible, disproportionate number of deaths in young people when they were vaccinated. Yes, absolutely. Everybody has tried to dismiss this as nothing to see here. If it's young people where they have a bad lifestyle, drugs and that sort of thing. I mean, they will do anything except address the most obvious cause. And that again is something that just I find unbelievable. My medical colleagues told me when I said, I believe this is really causing a total lack of control of my long-term melanoma patients. They said, there's no evidence, don't upset the patients and be quiet. That's what they told me. And they said, you're the only one. Now, where have I heard that before? And then I've met a lot of other people, said the same thing, all told to shut up, you're the only one. It's the post office scandal all over again. It's this kind of shutting down from the top. You're not allowed to do, to make these observations and safety anymore.
I love the work that Ed Dowd's done, and he not only talks about excess deaths, mortality, but also excess morbidity, illness, sickness, disabilities as well. That's one of my final questions. I want to come back to that if that's all right. So I'm interested in the impact that this has had on the immune system and future health risks. And I think it's called VAIDS, or vaccine-induced autoimmune deficiency syndrome. So are people suffering immune system fatigue?
Yes, they definitely are. It is interesting that you mentioned that. What I find really unbelievable is that in colleagues of mine, who are senior physicians, immunologists, etc., they've confided to me that in the last few years they've developed these horrible autoimmune conditions. And I mean, they really are rare. Autoimmune conditions really affect their life, interfering with lung function, blood function, all sorts of things, joints, etc. And when I've talked about it and asked when they got it, and I asked them about their jab history, they tell me they've never thought to put the two together. Was this caused by the jab? And then I point out that you didn't have any symptoms till you had the jab. And this is a really bad autoimmunity. You're on steroids. You're often on anti-TNF treatment. It does not occur to you, And you must have known, because I told everybody about the origin of the virus, and that 80% of it was human epitopes, absolutely designed to induce dreadful autoimmunity. So if the people at the top are being brainwashed, that even when they get affected by it, they don't put two and two together, what hope has there been for everybody else, the medical profession, to take a proper stance on how to diagnose and treat this and prevent it?
Is there a correlation between the number of jabs or boosters that people have had and the diminution in the immune system or increase in its fatigue or morbidity and mortality numbers?
Yes, there definitely is. I mean, some people get away with nothing at all with a couple of jabs. I mean, I know a lot of people, but that does not mean that they're safe.
No, and I read something the other day which I was gobsmacked about, which is I don't remember what the site's called, but you can basically go and check your lot, your batch.
Mm.
And they've found in certain batches that 90% of people who had that batch ended up with terrible outcomes.
Mm.
But another batch, no one had any outcomes whatsoever. So there were hot batches and cold batches and medium batches probably. But I'm this vaccine-induced autoimmune deficiency syndrome, immune system fatigue, whatever we want to call it. I just wonder what, given the impact that's had already on deaths, people dying, injured, disabled, caring for the dying and disabled. What impact is that going to have over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years to life expectancy, the productive workforce, in the country, if we don't stop this?
Well, it's already had a big impact. We have about a quarter of all adults of working age claiming that they're too ill to work and claiming benefits. I mean, it's an absolute disaster for the economy. I mean,
Yes, I think there's about 4 or 5 million people who are claiming that they're disabled or injured and are unable to work and claiming benefits. But so that's already a horrible number. But if we keep giving people boosters, is that not going to make the situation worse and worse and worse?
Of course it is, of course. And why on earth are they doing it? As I said, if you have to give a booster, the vaccine doesn't work. What point are they going to realise that? Not only does it not work, but you actually start destroying the person's immune system, so they're more likely to get injured. The Cleveland Clinic study is absolutely wonderful in that. It shows that the more vaccines you have, the more infections you get, and the worse the infection. And yet still our government are bullying people like me. I ignore the text, so I get letter after letter saying I must have a booster to protect myself as I'm at risk, presumably because of my age. But the government, under the pressure from the big pharma, will find excuses that virtually everybody's at risk. Because you only have to have one minor condition and you're at risk and therefore can have the booster. And why are they doing this? Well, I asked a senior person when I was at the parliamentary committee why they were still bullying when it's so obvious from all the evidence. 1, they don't work. 2, they're very dangerous. And their only response was, well, we bought so many of them, we might as well use them up. Well, the figure was actually used in Australia recently. They bought 180 million vaccines of COVID vaccines for a population of 20. So that's 9 each. What do they want to do? Exterminate the entire country? Fortunately, they've risen up, and the number of people who are having the boosters voluntarily was down to 4% the last time I looked, which tells you people know much better than their government. But they still voted in the same government that mistreated them, just, in Australia, just like Canada.
Why were doctors and scientists who disagreed about the safety of the jab censored, cancelled, deplatformed, fired, debanked, or that's surely not the scientific method.
No, it's not. It's totalitarianism and dystopia. I mean, it's straight out 1984. Shoot the whistleblower. That's what they were doing.
Can the drug companies be sued for the C19 jabs?
Before I answer this, I point out that they claim that they have complete identity for their products. However, I'm not a lawyer, but if I was, I would point out they do not have identity for fraud and sophistry and many other things, which we know they have. I mean, the number of billion-dollar fines that Pfizer have had over the last few years, when you look at it, it says the fines are basically for presenting false information, withholding safety data, bribing clinicians, and bribing regulators. Well, now I would conclude that they must have exceeded themselves, so they bribed everybody else, to the politicians, to everybody who's involved in the regulatory process. And that, I believe, is a crime and falls outside the indemnity for the product.
Outside the indemnity, that?
Yeah.
Is that the PrEP Act? And
yes.
Yeah. So why, when the harms seem so obvious and now so well documented by doctors and epidemiologists and virologists and oncologists and experts all around the world, has it not been stopped already?
Well, that is the big question. It is like they've gone so far with it, they don't want to turn back and admit fault. And then some of them are relying on the fact, well, if we do this, that we'd be up against class action things, etc., which would be, economy destroying. Well, I would argue they've already destroyed the economy with the way they handled COVID. That was what put 1.5 trillion extra on our debt. Why it's now in the UK over 2.7 trillion and rising. Everything they did for this was not necessary. Had they listened to people like me and the hundreds of other people who were the only ones pointing this out, if they actually listened to us, we were all senior, we'd all been through all this stuff many times before, there would never have been a lockdown. There would never have been a vaccine. And that's the other thing I wanted to really get across, is that in addition to doing all this research on this spike protein and how bad it would be for a vaccine, we published that I think was the definitive paper showing only the innate immune system works for these vaccines, and that we surveyed all the ones that can do that, and they're easy, cheap, non-toxic to do so. But we reviewed the 20 years effort of the big pharma industry to make coronavirus vaccines. It was staggering. They all fail. And they all are toxic. And when they get to primates, they're lethal. They never tested these vaccines in primates because they knew that. But listen, this is the really important thing, is coronaviruses have a natural wavelength of about 3 months. At the end of 3 months, they change and mutate. So even a warp speed vaccine that they all boasted about, we get it out, warp speed messenger RNA, takes 6 to 7 months. Far too late. And then it's even worse. That vaccine you give everybody locks in your immune system to dealing with the first virus that's now totally disappeared. And so all the resources are against that. So the second virus comes along, it doesn't see it properly. And so they vaccinate it again, and it makes more antibodies. They don't neutralize these new variants. They allow them to infect the cells easier through a process called antibody-dependent enhancement. I mean, anybody who knew any virology or immunology at all should never have allowed these vaccines to have been inflicted as the biggest piece of grievous bodily harm ever inflicted on a population by their own government in history.
Angus, I want to wrap this conversation up. Thank you so much for such great answers to all of the questions I've asked you. we've talked a lot about the problem, a massive problem. And so how in the UK could this be stopped or paused? Who could make that decision?
The person who could make the decision and should have is Chris Whitty. He's the chief medical officer. It's his job. He's been bought without a doubt because he made very sensible things before, and then all of a sudden he starts talking this nonsense. And what happens? So did Valence. Again, nonsense. I mean, they've been talking about it. What happened to them? They kept quiet. They went along with all this. They get knighthoods, and they've been made fellows of the Royal Society, which has already shot itself in the foot by presenting people who haven't bothered to look at the evidence. So this society is now an absolute disgrace, I believe. And so
but really what you're saying is that the people who could stop this and could make the decision aren't going to.
exactly. They've been told not to.
By whom?
Well, the people above, the government and everybody else. Remember all these institutions, people, if you're a really good scientist, you really want to become a fellow of the Royal Society. If you do things in life, you really want to be honoured with a knighthood and stuff like that. And they'll say, shut up and we'll make sure you get everything you want. Just shut up. That's how they've done it. They should have resigned over it. I mean, Whitty should have resigned. So you either stop this or I resign.
Okay, so what I'm hearing and what I'm reading and watching elsewhere is that those people who are at the top, who could stop this, despite the overwhelming evidence of the harm, aren't actually going to press pause or stop for some reason.
Yes.
And I think that on one level, it's what you were just talking about. I've been saying this is great for the last 4 years. If I turn around tomorrow and said it's terrible and should be stopped, then I'd look a bit of a fool and I might not get my peerage or knighthood or whatever.
Well, they've already got that.
All right. But so they keep recidivistically doing bad stuff because they don't want to admit that it's harmful. So we, the people, need to express our dissatisfaction with that. And that's what the Truth Contract is all about. We want to get millions and millions of ordinary people to watch this video and understand what's happened, understand that there are ways in which they can detox and heal themselves, which we'll make sure we get in the show notes. There are things that they can do for themselves and their family and their children to help them heal and recover, which is great. But also, we can't just swipe this under the carpet. And the reason for that is that there is already a gigantic cost to the economy of what's happened. And it's clear and obvious that that cost is going to increase and increase and increase over time if it's not stopped.
Yes.
And so, because that will affect the pocketbook of everyone in the country, it's like, hang on a minute, enough's enough. And I worry that the class action suits that you were talking about earlier on, it's like, oh my gosh, if we had to admit that this wasn't safe and we hadn't properly tested it and we ended up being sued, that could cost 5 trillion in damages or whatever the thing. Dr. David Martin talks about 18 trillion in America. So we, the people, have got to find a way in sufficient multi-millions of us to turn around to those in charge and say, stop. Mm-hmm. This cannot be used anymore. It's already cost the economy trillions. There's got 4 or 5 million people not working because of it. And we need this stopped because it's going to get a lot worse over the next 5 to 10 years if this isn't stopped. So my final question, Angus, is if we had a referendum on this, I've drafted something which would be the referendum policy that people would vote on, which I'd love you to comment on or help me tidy up. So what I've written is mRNA is unsafe, improperly safety tested, harmful medical intervention that should be stopped until further long-term independent double-blind placebo testing has been completed. The risks of human harm are too great. The actual harm has been significant and avoidable. The benefits are unclear and unevidenced. Furthermore, mRNA should not be rolled out in other experimental medical interventions in humans, nor in animals, or even food.
I agree with that.
Is it missing anything?
No, I mean, remember I'm one of the people that was behind and pushed the Hope Accord, which pushes exactly for that worldwide, and they're still ignoring that. I mean, that's exactly what we said in the Hope Accord.
I signed the Hope Accord.
Mm.
So, okay, well, what we're going to do is to create a referendum policy that we ultimately want to get millions and millions of people in this country, and I'm working with friends in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and elsewhere, but in the UK, I'm determined I'm going to get 10 million people to watch this video, understand what's happened and where we're up to, and realize that it's going to get a lot worse over the next 5 to 10 years in the economy and people's health if we do not pause this and stop it.
Agreed.
Right. Well, thank you so much indeed for your time. I'm so grateful to you. I have watched hundreds of your chats over the last few years, so it's a real honor and a privilege for me for you to give up your time today to chat with me. I really want us to do something about this, and all of the work that you and all the wonderful doctors that you mentioned during our chat, from Ryan Cole and Peter McCulloch, and everyone's doing great work. But for whatever reason, those in power who with the ability to stop this insanity aren't doing anything. So I feel that we, the people, have got to support what you're doing in millions by telling those in power this has to be stopped.
Agree.
This has got to be bottom up as well as top down. So we want to bring the cavalry to support people like you, with millions of people supporting you from the bottom up.
Good.
Finally, is there anything else you'd like to add, Angus, to something that we haven't discussed that we should have discussed?
I think the one thing I would really like to emphasize is that well, it's actually probably morphed into two, is that one, that Rishi Sunak signed off a massive deal with Moderna to produce a messenger RNA factory at Didcot, where he basically committed 100 million a year or $1 billion over 10 years to subsidize them to produce messenger RNA vaccines for viruses that might pose a problem. That is an absolute disgrace. They did exactly the same in Australia. And my Australian colleagues said this is absolutely the same. The Prime Minister signed it off themselves. It never went out to tender as far as they were concerned. And I just note that this doesn't seem to be quite right when Moderna got this, and his wife's family are major investors in Moderna, and he's now worth 600 million in the rich list. There's something rotten going on here, which I think we must rise up against. It's like they've already taken the decision, the elite and the very rich, that this will keep them super rich for the rest of their life without considering the consequences. No, it could actually destroy the human genome if it's given. If you give enough of these vaccines to young people, I just couldn't contemplate what damage it could do.
Well, that will, I think, maybe need to be another program. Angus, thank you so much indeed. Great to have you with us, and look forward to staying in touch.
Okay.